When I was 14 years old, my family and I went on a boating trip out of Melbourne's western Port Bay. I remember being at the helm with my father, steering the little boat over the waves, and then the next thing we knew, my big brother was shouting that water was coming and happened so fast. Mom and Dad were shouting for us to stay together, and then suddenly, the boat tipped over, and we were in the water. We later found out that the bottom of our boat had been almost completely rotten and that its owners had been extremely and willfully negligent in renting it to us. We had no choice but to start swimming. Since it was late in the evening, no one had seen us go down, so it was up to us to rescue ourselves. I was a reasonably good swimmer, and we all had life jackets on, but it was still around 2 miles back to shore. Land looked like it was a long, long way away. Darkness fell as we were swimming, but my dad started to struggle, and my big brother swam back to try and help him. My mom and I stuck together and kept going, but we soon lost sight of my father and brother. Seagulls cried out above me, and I kept imagining that they were warning me of an attack from sharks that were no doubt swimming in the waters around us. I could see land, but it didn't seem to get any closer. Finally, after more than 3 hours in that water, I felt the sandy bottom against my feet. I'd reached the mud flats of what I believed was the mainland, but my mom, dad, and brother were nowhere to be seen. I was weak, cold, and exhausted. I dragged myself through the mud, which at some points was almost up to my waist, and this was even more terrifying than the swimming. The mud kept on sucking me down, and I was terrified that I'd sink and be suffocated. My muscles ached, my lungs burned, and I felt like I was about to pass out at points, but at the same time, I knew the clock was ticking, that it was essentially down to me and me alone to get help from my family. The clock was ticking in my head, and I needed to get my family the help they badly needed. When I finally made it ashore, I realized that I was on French Island, an island with an old disused prison on it that has only about 40 people on it. I ran through the bushland, using up the last reserves of my energy, it felt like, and feeling thorns scratching against my legs and arms. I ran for a long time too, stopping every so often to catch my breath before continuing through the bush. Finally, I found a house, and after banging on the door, someone opened it, and I told them what had happened. I just remember crying and crying as they tried to comfort me and how I begged them to help find my family. They told me everything was going to be okay and that they'd contacted the Victoria Coast Guard. I appreciate that they were just trying to console me, but I knew they were wrong. The next morning, the bodies of my mom, dad, and older brother were recovered from the water off the coast of Fairhaven. Words can't express how devastated I was, and I was filled with this overwhelming survivor guilt, thinking that I should be the one dead. For 5 long years, I was a wreck, and I think I might be dead from drink and drugs if it wasn't for the birth of my first kid. For a long, long time, I avoided any kind of large body of water, which included swimming pools, before my therapist suggested that I undertake some exposure therapy. This would involve brief trips to a local pool, but at first, my anxiety was so bad that even if my head was above the water, I just couldn't breathe. I tried for 4 months, but nothing worked until a local swim coach heard my story and offered some help. Over the next year or so, the therapy started to chip away at my fear until finally, I was able to look at the sea without feeling like I was about to have a panic attack. My proudest moment has been taking part in a charity swim across the Rip, which is an infamously rough stretch of water. We helped raise money for a domestic violence charity here in Australia, which is a cause very close to my heart for reasons that could well make for another true scary story. It might have taken me 20 years, but I no longer let my fear control me. I now understand that what happened wasn't my fault, but the irony of needing water to heal the very trauma that it created has never been lost on me. On April 17, 1918, the SS Dummerup set sail from Portland, Oregon, bound for the South Pacific. Owned by the U.S. Shipping Board, the 270 feet, 500-ton wooden steamer would transport goods between the United States and the many Philippine islands approximately 7,000 miles to its east. Its manufacturers, the Grant Smith Porter Ship Company, had high hopes for their creation, but right away, ill omens prompted hushed concern. When the ship launched in Portland during the spring of 1918, it tumbled into the water and smashed into several houseboats on the Willamette River. The ship's captain, a hardy Scandinavian named Ola Berenson, dismissed the apprehensions of his anxious crew members, and they set sail for San Francisco during the finer climes of the late summer. The Dumaru departed the United States in September of 1918, made a stop in Hawaii, and then sailed on to Guam. Finally, on October 16th, the ship sailed out of Guam's Opera Harbor destined for the Philippine capital of Manila. Only then was it loaded up with its final cargo, which just so happened to be several thousand gallons of gasoline and a monumental shipment of trinitrotoluene, more commonly known as TNT. As the Dumaru pulled out of Opera Harbor, heavy storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Then, before long, the storm broke in earnest. The Dumaru crashed through the roaring waves of the Philippine Sea, its crew battling the elements to keep her afloat. Then suddenly, disaster struck. A bolt of lightning streaked through the sky, striking the Dumaru's wooden deck and setting off a chain reaction that ignited both the shipment of gasoline and the crates full of dynamite. In the years that followed, survivor Theron Bean stated that the forwardmost portion of the ship simply erupted into flame following the bright white flash. Soon after, the call went out to abandon ship. The ship's crew rushed aboard its 3 life vessels, which consisted of a small raft and 2 boats. But in their panic, the men failed to evenly distribute themselves between the 3 vessels. This meant that while one of the lifeboats departed with just 9 people aboard and 11 empty seats, the other became dangerously overloaded with over 30 terrified sailors hanging on for dear life. Soon after, the 3 vessels were separated by rough seas. On October 26, 1918, the Sunday Oregonian reported that Captain Berenson, his second mate, and 3 crew members had been found alive and well. They had been picked up by a transport ship just 9 days after the Dumaru exploded. Their quest for survival was over. Their shipmates, on the other hand, were not so fortunate. Theron Bean, who found himself crammed aboard the boat of 32, stated that they rode through the night until finally, the rising sun revealed Guam on the horizon. Yet, the Dumaru's survivors were horrified when a sudden change of wind and currents sent their boat off course, floating aimlessly in the Philippine Sea. The men's hopes were reignited by the sudden appearance of a passing steamer. They began frantically rowing in its direction, waving and shouting as they went, but frustratingly, they remained unspotted as it sailed past them and into the distance. For the next few days, the sailors hoped and prayed for favorable winds. But as time passed, the situation grew critical. Their daily rations allowed for only 2 tablespoons of water and 1 piece of hardtack. Then, after 7 days of drifting, they found themselves too weak to row. Around 2 weeks into their ordeal, the first of the survivors began to die from exposure. 3 days later, they ran out of hardtack, while the heavens had failed to provide them with a single drop of rain. Some grew so thirsty that they began to drink salt water. All who did so died in agony just hours after their first sip. Other savvier sailors fashioned a makeshift catchment device, otherwise known as an evaporator, using their shoes, the boat's oars, along with some spare wood they'd managed to chip away from it, with which to fuel a small fire. It was a creative but futile attempt to replenish their water supplies. Ultimately, they decided that desperate times called for desperate measures. After a brief but confrontational discussion, one of the starving sailors took a rubber hose from a bailing pump and fashioned it into a makeshift fishing line. He then took a knife and began carving off pieces of his dead shipmate's flesh. After tying the meat to the improvised fishing line, he used it as bait to attract nearby schools of fish. Eventually, a group of dolphins passed by. After luring one ever closer with the tempting taste of human flesh, the sailors speared it, killed it, and butchered it. Theron Bean later wrote that the dolphin's meat and moisture were warmly welcomed but scarcely commended the method by which it was obtained. Finally, on the 24th day of their ordeal, the survivors of the SS Dumaru began to drift towards land. There had been weak celebration upon its sighting, and for the first time in weeks, the men felt some semblance of hope return. Little did they know, the worst was yet to come. As their lifeboat approached white tropical sands, choppy waves caused it to capsize. The surviving sailors were tossed among a seabed strewn with jagged skeletal coral, inflicting terrible gashes and scrapes to their tender sunburned skin. Some men were simply too weak to swim to shore and drowned among the coral, failing at the final hurdle. In a tragic turn of events, of the 32 men who climbed into the Doomaroo lifeboat on the day it exploded, only 14 of them lived to tell the tale. Those that returned were treated as minor celebrities and, like Thean Bean, were venerated by a sympathetic media that was already buzzing with excitement over the Great War in Europe. They were treated as men of grit, will, and determination, while those who died were revered as great Americans, men who braved wild frontiers not just for their own enrichment but for the benefit of their families and their nation. Thean Bean claimed that upon their passing, his fallen comrades were given respectful burial at sea. But the truth was deeply and disturbingly different. Almost 12 years later, on January 1st of the year 1930, a man named Eliel Thomas published a book which stunned the American maritime community. It was entitled The Wreck of the Doomaroo, A Story of Cannibalism. In his book, Mr. Thomas claimed that after extensive interviews with one of the ship's survivors, who wished to remain anonymous, it was quite certain that the shipwrecked sailors of the SS Doomaroo had resorted to cannibalism in order to survive. The book caused outrage and indignation among vast swaths of the American public, so much so that a reporter from the New York Times was tasked with verifying Mr. Thomas's account. This reporter subsequently discovered that not only was Mr. Thomas's source a reliable one, being the Doomaroo's assistant engineer Fred Harmon, but his narrative was identical to the U.S. Navy's own official version of the incident. According to the report taken from a U.S. naval base in the Philippine Islands, 4 of the Doomaroo survivors passed away on the 18th day of their ordeal. One of these men, the ship's first engineer, had supposedly permitted his fellow sailors to consume his flesh upon his passing, and so they did. After carving off pieces of the dead man's flesh, the surviving sailors boiled the meat in a kerosene can. It tasted good, the assistant engineer reportedly stated. Everyone seemed to feel a little better after eating. The next day, the survivors ate a little more, but this time Harmon reported that the amount of salt in the meat made everyone sick and crazy. Harmon also stated that the proposal to cannibalize the dead was the suggestion of a Greek sailor he referred to as George. Wielding a hatchet, George was alleged to have demanded that they consume the flesh of the fallen. "We're all dying," he reported. George yelled, "Cook the chief or I'll do it myself." Finally, on the orders of the Doomaroo first mate, George the Greek prepared the flesh of the dead men for consumption and did so under the watchful eye of a lieutenant named E.V. Holmes. The lieutenant went ahead and ordered the Greek to place small parts of flesh on the wooden boat bailer that was shaped like a large sugar scoop and then wash them in the sea. Harmon said afterward, the wooden bailer was passed around to all. Harmon went on to state that George the Greek ate first and then, I quote, offered the flesh to Holmes, who took it and ate it, thereby showing the rest of us that he desired us to do likewise. We ourselves had come around to George's way of thinking, and we decided to go right on with what the Greek started. Though the men had initially been horrified at the idea of eating their crewmates, they eventually agreed that it was, and I quote, the only possible means of saving our lives, and for our comrades, it was a fate not much worse than to be eaten by sharks. After eating the head engineer, they allegedly also ate a Hawaiian mess boy who had grown so weak that he couldn't move. Following the publication of Eliel Thomas's highly controversial account, the Doomaroo survivors admitted that the reports of cannibalism were true. However, the Connecticut Examiner went on to report that, quote, speculation still persisted about several disappearances, speculating that some men jumped overboard and became shark food rather than risk being eaten by their comrades, and grisly unsubstantiated rumors of casting lots before an unlucky chief engineer and Hawaiian mess boy were killed, cooked, and eaten. Reports of cannibalism and the allegations of voluntary deaths include details that are beyond horrifying. But perhaps one of the more subtly chilling aspects of this case is that had it not been for a shift in the wind or had the passing steamer noticed the small lifeboat and come to its rescue, this grisly and terrifying episode might well have been averted entirely. A few years ago, I went on a Hawaii cruise with a few friends. It started out as a great little vacation. However, by the third day at sea, things started getting weird. After 2 days of eating constant sushi, I started to feel a little dizzy and lightheaded at times. My friends told me no more sushi, as it probably had something to do with that. But anyway, after a few drinks, I separated myself from my friends, who were sitting in one of the ship's many bars, and started walking back to my room because I really wasn't feeling too well. I took some weird lower deck route back in the direction of my room since some of the bars were on the lowest public levels of the ship. I asked one of the maids in the hallway which way was the quickest to get to the section my room was in. The maid had a very thick accent, but I understood her to have said, "Keep going straight, then make a left at the sign." So I did that. I came to a sign. I don't remember what it said, but it was a sign, so I turned left there. I was in some narrow hall with a tiled floor instead of carpeting. It didn't seem like the right way to go at all. It seemed more like an employee-only section. Still, I figured I'd give it a chance before turning back and continued down this narrow hall. I came to a corner, then looked to my right, and here was the creepiest hallway you could possibly find on the ship. Half the lights were out, one was flashing on and off, but at the end of this tiny hallway was someone standing, facing the wall. My head started to hurt even more as I saw this. I had to rub my eyes to make sure what I was seeing was real. When I moved my hands away from my eyes, the person standing by the wall was now looking at me. Considering they were standing in the dark section of this hallway, not lit up by lights, I couldn't really see much about their actual face other than that I knew they were looking at me. I turned and went back the direction I came. I walked back down the hall. The maid was gone now. However, with my head still killing me, I managed to get back to the lobby of this floor, and at that point, finding the elevators was easy. I made it back to my room easily at that point and crashed into bed. I was sure I had gotten food poisoning from the sushi because my stomach was also hurting along with my head. Anyway, I woke up at some odd hour in the night and I couldn't move. The only thing I could move were my eyes. I tried looking around the room, but my inability to move my head or sit in an upright position made seeing a lot of the room difficult. I remember something seemed to appear in my peripheral vision. I turned my eyes to the opposite side of the room, and there was a figure facing the wall. As I looked at it, I wanted to scream or run, but I couldn't do anything. It was as real as could be. I knew I was seeing it. The head of the figure turned around to face me, but all I saw was black. The body, the face, everything about this figure just looked black. The figure started to move closer to me. The most disturbing thing about it, though, was that as it moved towards me, it didn't move its limbs. It seemed to just slowly float towards me. The figure stopped over my bed. Now I could slightly see a face to it, and I recognized it as that person I saw earlier in the night in that hallway. I don't remember exactly how long that figure stood over my bed, but suddenly I saw its mouth open twice as wide as you'd expect to be humanly possible. Out came a deafeningly real scream, so loud that I think it woke me up completely from the sleep paralysis I was just in. The craziest thing I remember was the scream of this sleep paralysis figure feeding into the scream of my own voice. I was finally able to make a sound. I flicked on the light, and my friend who was in the other bed woke up asking what was wrong. I told him about the horrible experience I just had. He once again said I'd been eating way too much raw fish and it was messing with my head. My whole body was shaking, and my voice was trembling. I went back to sleep and don't remember having another dream that night. But I still wonder if that person I saw in the hallway was real or not, because I'm 90% sure that's the hallucination I had in my paralysis. That hallucination was also the realest, most horrific thing I'd ever seen. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.